One of the questions I'm asked most frequently is about moving to PON, and would I make a video about how to go about doing that? And so that's what we're going to do today. So join me with a tasty beverage of your choice close to hand while we take a look at moving to PON. And before we get underway, I've got another little friend in bloom this week. This is Hoya carnosa Mariana, and it's blooming again. This plant has been so much fun. I love, the blooms are beautiful. I love Hoya blooms. I love these undulate-edged leaves. It's just a very, very pretty, and I put some close-ups of the blooms and the leaves on the side here, and he's got a little bit of sulfur on him because I think I've got a little bit of a resurgence of flat mites, so we're trying to be preemptive, and they seem to be over on this shelf, so everybody there is getting a little dose of sulfur. But yeah, this is cool. This one blooms fairly regularly, and this is Hoya carnosa Mariana. And a quick thank you to everyone who has so far responded to last week's question about where you're located. I'm leaving that open. We're going to do the list, we're going to show the list next week. So if you haven't yet, include a comment with your location. I don't want your address, but city, state, or province, and the country you live in. That would be great. If you've already done that, I got you. You're on the list, and you'll be included. So yeah, thanks, and let's see what we can do about that. And there's no kits. Well, there are a couple, and you'll see them. But let's start off, and we'll talk about PON. Okay, so I'm going to start off with PON is not the answer. It's an option. Now, PON is an inorganic mix. I've got all kinds of notes here, so you'll have to pardon if I have to read some of them. It's typically of pumice, lava rock, and zeolite. Commercial brand name PON also can have slow release fertilizer added to it. I use a generic PON that doesn't have that because, well, I'll get into that later. But anyway, pumice is an extremely airy, rough textured volcanic glass. It's lightweight, it's porous, and it can be somewhat abrasive. Matter of fact, when they make stonewash jeans, they usually tumble them with pumice. That's what abrades and gives that worn look. The nature of pumice allows for the movement of gases and moisture between the rock and the surrounding area. It holds moisture and nutrients in all those little nooks and crannies, but it's not melted butter, it's nutrients and moisture. It doesn't decompose, and it has very little compaction, meaning it doesn't pack down as it breaks down. Lava rock is, again, something that comes from the volcanic process, much the same type of properties. It's airy, it's light, moisture can get trapped in all its little nooks and crannies. It doesn't break down, and it doesn't compact. And finally, zeolite. And zeolite is a microporous aluminosilicate. And it's frequently used as an absorbent commercially. So it will pull in moisture. And its purpose is to absorb, hold, and release moisture. Zeolite can hold 55% of its own weight in water and then release it as it's needed by plants. So because it can hold moisture so well, it can help smooth out the dry cycles between waterings. It can just make sure that moisture is available consistently to your plant. Now, PON is available in different sizes. The ingredients are available in different sizes, and the proportions range from 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 to different combinations. Some people grow in less of one, more of another. Some people grow in straight pumice. And you'll have to kind of work out what works best for you in your own unique environment. So I think PON, for me, works most effectively in self-watering pots. And also with my self-watering pot, I top water to make sure that the PON that's in the container gets saturated and doesn't solely depend on pulling moisture up from the reservoir, particularly if your plants are small or newly established, and we'll talk about that. When your plants are established in PON and they're growing actively, the root system will develop and will pull moisture from the PON itself and will pull water up indirectly through the wick from the reservoir. But until that time, you need to make sure that there's moisture available in the PON for the roots, particularly with a young plant or a recent transfer. The system hasn't had time. And a plant in PON or organic in a self-watering pot is a system. So until it gets established and going, it's good to make sure that there's moisture available to whatever roots have developed so far. I don't think I would recommend using self-watering pots for a soil-based mixture. I've tried self-watering with some of my aeroids like philodendron and epipremnum. And you have to use it's an interesting mix you have to use. If you use pretty much soil or potting soil, that mix is going to stay very, very wet. And to be honest with you, it didn't work well. So I think something much more like an aeroid mix, chunky, airy, with some stuff in there to hold some moisture, like long fiber sphagnum or tree fern fiber, might work. That kind of a mix could also work for Hoyas and other epiphytes. Let's see. Talked about self-watering, organic mix. I also use an organic mix with some of my self-watering pots, and it works really well. The thing that I have noticed about organic mix in self-watering is that, so you have a reservoir, you have a wick. The wick helps water be drawn up to be accessed by the plant and the mix. An organic mix is an extension of that wick. So they tend, in my experience, in my situation, the mix tends to pull moisture from that reservoir a lot. So my plants in organic mix tend to need to be filled off, topped up, replenished more frequently than the ones in PON. At least that seems to be my experience. So a couple caveats. When you start to use PON, you must rinse it. You need to get rid of the dust. And while pumice and zeolite and lava rock won't break down, they won't decompose, they will chip, especially in transit. When they toss that bag of PON on your front porch, sometimes the little nooks and crannies get a little broken down. You want to rinse that away because you don't want it in your reservoir. Don't rinse your PON directly in the sink. And I'm going to repeat that. Do not rinse your PON directly in the sink or the tub or anything whose plumbing you care about. All that dust that you're rinsing off is essentially stone dust, and it will settle in your pipes and it will pack and it will clog your pipes. And you don't want to do that. So what I do is I put a bucket or some other container in the sink and rinse the PON into the bucket. That's like now during the winter. It's winter here in the Northern Hemisphere. It's too cold. In the summertime, I take the hose and the sieve and the PON and I rinse it off outside. But don't rinse your PON into the sink. You don't want the bills or the annoyance. So I'm going to start a video shortly of me repotting a couple of ponds from whatever they came in to self-watering pots and PON. Watching me handle the roots the way I'm going to might be a triggering event for some people, and they might just look at it and say, I can't do that. I can't do that. And if you feel that way, don't. You don't have to move your plants to PON. It's just an option. Second thing is, if you want to move or try out PON, do not move all your plants to PON at once. Pick one plant that you feel you could afford to lose. Now, I have a really good success rate with transferring plants to PON. I can only think of maybe one or two that I've lost over the course of several years. So it can still happen. So pick a plant that you can afford to lose and use that one. Do one. Buy a small bag of PON, a self-watering pot, and do one plant only. And after 3 or 4 months, when you've seen how the plant responds and the time it takes to respond, and you feel comfortable with it, then if it works for you or seems to be working, then you can think about moving other plants to PON. Don't do them all at once. Trust me on that one. Okay. Let's see what other warnings I wanted to send out. Okay, I think that's it. So we're going to switch to an overhead view, and I'm going to repot a couple of plants into PON. Get your tasty beverage handy, settle back, and let's watch the move. So the first thing I do is I make sure I've got all my tools handy, everything I'm going to need. So I've got a chopstick, I've got some tweezers, I've got some scissors, I've got a little towel, a little cleanup rag, I've got a big container, it's over here on the side, of rinsed PON, all set to go. I've got the pot I'm going to use, the self-watering pot, is all set up. And I've got a container of water. Because once you start, you don't want to stop with this. And I've got the plant I'm going to do. In this case, I got a carnosa compacta, a plain green one, specifically for this demonstration. I don't know what I'm going to find in here. It looks like it's bark and soil and maybe some perlite stuff, but we'll see. I also have some organic mix already made up and nearby. If you get into the plant and you find out that the roots are really, really fine or just massively entwined in whatever mix it's in, then you may want to change path and look at something else rather than PON. This looks pretty good. So I'm just going to go through and start breaking up the soil because it seems to be, I don't know, that looks like cactus mix. It's very fine grained. Looks like sand in there. Everybody seems to have pretty good roots. I usually try and water the plant the day before I'm going to do this. It's just easier sometimes if the soil is, I mean, that's like sand. And this came from, well, I don't know if they grew it, but a reputable local seller. So I'm just going in, loosening up, seeing if I can coax these roots apart. You're going to do some damage. Just resolve and resign yourself to that fact. There we go. And the idea is to do as little as possible. A lot of times you'll find that the roots, if there's pieces of bark, they don't grow into the bark as much as next to it. And I know this might be triggering for some people who panic about Hoya roots, but Our goal here is to try and remove as much organic matter as we can. Okay. So I'm just going to pick through, roll it between my fingers gently. The first time you do this, it's terrifying. First time I did it, was like terrifying. And there are still going to be instances where you're not going to do too much or be able to do too much. And your plant may not survive. I mean, there's always that possibility. So go into it with that approach that this is just a big pot of tiny little cuttings. But they're well rooted. So I'll go through and I'll pick out that's a nice one. Sometimes you have to break the pieces of bark apart and tear them apart, get in there with your fingernails and pull them apart. Or you may just have to get out your scissors and trim that root. It's always kind of an adventure. Just damaged that one, but there's not a lot you can do. Another handy little tool is it's an old toothbrush. And I'm just going to go in and start removing any big chunks of bark as best I can, as gently as I can. Once you start this process, you don't want to stop because you are dealing with roots. They will dry out kind of quickly. And if it seems like it's been a while, go in and dip it in the water. It's part of what the water's here for. Don't be too aggressive, but you can be deliberate. I'm going to put that in the water. Take a look at this one. I didn't realize there were so many cuttings in this. I was thinking it was just 2 or 3, but there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cuttings. Okay. All right, I'm going to let that kind of, let's get this last one off here. I'm going to put that into the water as well. And let's see who else is looking. That one's looking good and healthy. You don't want to rush this. You do want to take your time and be deliberate, but you don't want this taking any longer than it has to. Now, if you open up the pot and you find out that your Hoya has really fine roots, some species have very fine roots, you may need to change your mind and not move it to PON. Move it into an organic mix. And if you're adamant about growing it in PON, then move it to the organic mix, take cuttings from it, and root those in PON. I always leave myself the option of doing organic, simply because if the roots are too fine, then they're not going to survive this transfer process very well. So you can see in there, there's a little bit of Okay, that's the end of a stem. Okay, that's going in the water. Three, let's see what we got here. It's a really good. So you're just going to go through and gently kind of pick stuff out. I'm not always crazy about the mixes that plants come in. I like, my mix works for me. Your mix works for you. And you grow as you do. So it's usually easy if something's been rooted in sphagnum. It's usually really easy. Just get the sphagnum really moist, and if you gently coax it out from the roots, it usually cooperates without too much difficulty. I didn't used to like getting stuff rooted in sphagnum, but now I'm a little bit better about it. Okay. All right, so there's 4 cuttings. I'm going to set these 2 aside and get to them later. So this is what it was in. It looks really sandy. It looks, I don't know, it's probably cocoa coir and sand. That's what I'm thinking. I don't know if that'll focus, but I'm thinking it's cocoa coir and sand with some perlite. All right, so let me get rid of this and we'll get ready for the next step. Okay, so I've had these soaking in water for just a couple of minutes. I'm going to kind of give them a little bit more of a brush, but I'm not going to get too ate up about anything other than big chunks of bark. Ideally, you want to get all this stuff out of there. There we go. Room temperature water. You don't like your feet being dunked in ice water, so there we go. There's some stuff you're just not going to worry about. What you're looking for are the big chunks of bark. Because you don't want that in your PON. There we go. If your plant has a fairly well-developed root system, I mean, this procedure is traumatic. There's no 2 ways about it. But if it's got a fairly well-developed root system, then it will survive this. So be a little brave. And if you get a plant, if you're thinking of moving it to PON from some other medium, then and you have any doubts, like, oh, I don't know what the roots are like, how strong it is, then let it go for a little bit. That's not too bad. You can rinse this under water, under running water in the sink as well. I just I like working at my table in the plant room. Okay. And this one's got really good roots. Those are hefty. I have a pretty good survival rate on this procedure. So they can handle it. Just realize that it's once you get them into the pond and get them settled, that it's going to be a few months until they've really recovered from this procedure. So don't expect a lot of new growth right away. You've done a lot to these kids, so it's going to take a little bit of time to recover. There it is. And just one little, there we go. Just a little clump in there that was a little bit too much. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Now, if you're moving from PON, if you've rooted your stuff in PON, then this procedure is going to be a lot easier because you don't have to remove anything. Okay. So we're going to do another little bit of cleanup, and then we'll be back. And we're back, having cleaned up a little bit. So my next step is I take my liner from the self-watering pot, set it down. I put a little bit of PON in the bottom. And I tend to tip the pot almost on its side and lay PON up one side of the pot. And then literally go in and lay down the cuttings anchor them in with a little bit of PON. I find it easier to work in sort of this semi-horizontal position for the pot, because then I can just lay the roots down on top of it and they'll be in a decent position in the soil. Last one. Just going in like that. making sure all the roots that I can see are in PON. There's a few over here. Let's see. Okay, so once you get them in, kind of go in with your chopstick and do a light little bit of shaking to get the PON to settle. Tap the sides, do whatever you need to do gently to get the PON to settle. There can be air gaps that occur while you're potting this up. And if there's a gap where it's air, that's where the roots can't reach the nutrients. So you want to make sure that they're all well settled in. And if you want to, you can go and clean up some of the pond debris, make it pretty. But everybody looks well settled in. There's a couple roots sneaking out the side. I'm not going to worry about that because they would eventually. And checking my wick at the bottom. And pop the plant in its new little home. Now, the other thing I like to do is to surface water. I'll put some water in the reservoir, some nutrient solution in the reservoir, but I want to make sure that there's some of that solution in the pond. So that those roots that we've just put in their new location can access that moisture. And there it is. So I gave it a nice full reservoir. It's all settled in. It's been cleaned up a little bit. I'm going to give it a tag. And he's ready for his new location. And I'm going to do one more little newbie cutting. This is Hoya leucantha. And it arrived just a couple of weeks ago. Not even that. So there's some sphag on the top. And it looks like a decent mix. Let's see what we... Okay, so that, as you can see, is what one could call very lightly rooted. I was hoping it was a little bit further along than this, but we're going to carry on bravely. And it's going to be a much simpler process. Ah, okay. Put a piece of screening in the bottom of the pot. Okay, so there's our cutting. And I've got my liner for the self-watering. In this case, I'm going to put in a good amount of PON. And I'm going to mound it up toward the center a little bit. And then get some more PON ready. I'm just going to set that right there. Let the few roots that there are spread out down the sides of that mound. And again, I'm going to do the same thing. Just go in and agitate around the pond so that it settles a bit. I'm going to give it just a tad more. And once he's all settled in, put him into his cover pot. Now, since there's just a tiny root system on this, I'm just going to surface water for the next, every couple of days for the next couple of days, and I'm going to put a small clear cup over the top to make it like a mini greenhouse. Give him his name tag, and he's ready for his new location as well. Okay, now those two examples went very, very easily. I didn't know going in what I was going to find within the containers. Well, on the Hoya leucantha, I had a clue because it came in a little clear cup. But the other plant, I had no idea, the carnosa compacta. Sometimes you'll get the plant out of the pot and it's growing in a really good organic mix. And it is glommed onto those chunks, to those nuggets, in a way that you just can't separate them. And I had that happen. I was all set to move one of my Hoyas, and it was just in that mix so well, it would have done too much damage to the roots. So what you do is, that's why you have that organic mix ready. You pot it up into self-watering and the organic mix. If you're convinced that you have to grow that plant in PON, then continue growing it in the organic mix, take cuttings, root them in PON, because I agree with Miro, I'm a big fan of root it in what you're going to grow it in. That makes the transfer from your rooting to your growing much easier. So root the cuttings up in PON and then grow them out and plant them in PON. Because, well, here's another thing to remember. PON is an inorganic mix. And that means that by its very nature, there are no nutrients in that. And I know a lot of people think you don't have to feed your Hoyas, but you do. And that's when they're in an organic mix. When they're in inorganic, you must feed them. They are not going to get the nutrients they need from simple water alone. So my suggestion is, and even if, giving them half dose of orchid fertilizer or foliar spray is not going to be enough. So my suggestion is, and what I do, is I use a hydroponic growing solution, plant food. I have a particular brand that I like, but there are other brands that are, I'm sure, just as effective. So you may need to experiment, talk to other people. There are hydroponic growing stores everywhere now, so maybe even stop in there and explain to them what you're doing and see what their recommendation is. You can find all of this stuff online, but find the one that works best for you. But you are going to have to feed your plants. There's nothing in that pond that's going to help them thrive. So if you've got questions, ask them in the comments, send me an email. I'm not a botanist and I'm not a geologist, and I will answer as best I can, but I don't have the answers for everything. But PON has been working for me. Well, and PON and organic. I've used both. They both work for me. They can both work for you. It's nice to have the option of PON in your repertoire. So, yep, Hope that was helpful. And this week's question isn't so much a question for you as it is for me. I thought for the last video of this year that we would do a Q&A. So in the comments below, post any questions you would like to ask. They can be on almost any topic you would like, and if I feel like answering them, I'll answer them. And so be nice, be creative, be funny, because you guys have great senses of humor, and post your questions below. And as usual, I want to thank you for choosing to spend some of your time with me this week's end. Please remember to click that thumbs up, like button, the notification bell, and the subscribe button. I just recently passed 2,000 subscribers, and that's all thanks to you guys. So I really appreciate it, and it's really important to my channel. A lot of the products you see me use are available through my Amazon storefront. I receive a small commission on the sales, but it doesn't affect your price at all. And there's a link in the description below. If you'd like to support my page, you can click on my Buy Me a Coffee page link, and there's one in the description. There's a link to that in the description. Or there's a thanks button down here someplace that YouTube manages for me. And you can click there if you'd like to help support my Hoya habit, in addition to supporting your own. I've got links to a couple more videos over here, and enjoy the rest of your week's end.